The setting sun cast long shadows across Pioneer Square in downtown Seattle, where a seemingly ordinary homeless man's quiet evening was about to turn into a defining moment that would shock the entire Pacific Northwest. Nobody passing by could have guessed that this disheveled figure would soon teach three arrogant bikers a lesson about respect and judgment that would go viral across social media and change dozens of lives. But then again, Michael "Ghost" Harrison wasn't your ordinary homeless veteran. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The early October chill had begun to settle over Seattle's historic district as Ghost, as he was known among the homeless community, adjusted the worn military surplus blanket around his shoulders. His weathered hands, still steady despite years on the streets, carefully arranged his few possessions in the recessed doorway of the old Merchants Cafe building, a spot he'd claimed as his own through an unspoken agreement with other local homeless residents. To passersby, he appeared to be just another unfortunate soul lost to the streets. Gray-streaked beard untrimmed, clothes layered and worn, an old military backpack serving as his pillow. But beneath the struggling veteran exterior lay something else entirely. Something that three members of the Steel Knights Motorcycle Club were about to discover the hard way. Ghost's real name hadn't been spoken aloud in nearly 7 years, not since he'd walked away from his former life after a classified operation in Syria went terribly wrong. The mission's outcome had left him wrestling with demons that even his extensive military training couldn't help him fight. Rather than risk bringing his darkness home to his family, he'd chosen to disappear into America's homeless population, becoming one of the countless invisible veterans who haunt our nation's streets. What the regular visitors to Pioneer Square didn't know was that before he became Ghost, Michael Harrison had served as a master sergeant in the Marine Corps' Elite Force Recon Unit. For 15 years, he had trained in advanced close-quarters combat, earning such a reputation for moving silently through enemy territory that his fellow operators had given him his nickname. Even now, 7 years later, those skills remained sharp, honed by the constant vigilance required to survive life on the streets. The square was relatively quiet for a Friday evening. A few tourists snapped photos of the historic totem pole, while office workers hurried past, eager to start their weekends. The smell of coffee from nearby cafes mixed with the salt air from Elliott Bay, creating the unique aroma that defined Seattle's oldest neighborhood. Everything seemed normal, until the rumble of heavyweight motorcycles shattered the evening calm. 3 bikes pulled up to the curb near Ghost's doorway, their engines reverberating off the old brick buildings before falling silent. The riders, wearing leather vests emblazoned with the Steel Knights MC patch, dismounted with the swagger of men used to commanding respect through intimidation. Their leader, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a beard dyed unnaturally black, spotted Ghost in his doorway and nudged his companions. Ghost noted their approach without appearing to look up, his years of tactical training automatically cataloging details. The leader's distinctive throat tattoo, the brass knuckles poorly concealed in the shortest one's vest pocket, the slight limp in the third man's walk suggesting a recent injury. His mind, still sharp despite years of hard living, calculated angles and distances, a habit he'd never lost from his combat days. 7 years ago, such a threat assessment would have been routine preparation for a mission. Now, it was just another survival skill for life on the streets. Ghost had learned early on that homeless veterans made easy targets for those looking to prove their toughness. Usually, he could avoid confrontation by simply moving on. But tonight, something in the biker's body language told him that wasn't going to be an option. As the 3 men approached, their boots scraping against the century-old sidewalk, Ghost remained still, his breathing calm and measured. The evening foot traffic in the square had thinned considerably, with the few remaining pedestrians already crossing to the other side of the street, sensing the impending confrontation. None of them wanted to get involved with what appeared to be another sad case of homeless harassment. Little did they know they were about to witness something that would challenge their preconceptions about both the homeless and veterans, spreading across social media and eventually reaching the highest levels of military leadership. The next few minutes would not only change lives, but spark a national conversation about how America treats its combat veterans. The leader of the 3 bikers stopped directly in front of Ghost's doorway, his shadow falling across the veteran's hunched form. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice carrying the artificial toughness of someone trying too hard to be intimidating. "Looks like we found ourselves some prime real estate boys. Think it's time we helped clean up the neighborhood." Ghost had seen their type before. Weekend warriors who confused intimidation with strength, mistaking cruelty for power. In his years on the streets, he'd learned to read people like a combat manual, and these three were broadcasting their intentions as clearly as if they'd announced them over a loudspeaker. The evening had been peaceful until now, with the usual mix of tourists and locals creating the familiar backdrop of city life that Ghost had grown accustomed to. The historic Pioneer Square district had been his home for the past 3 years, ever since he'd made his way up from Portland. The neighborhood's centuries-old buildings held countless stories within their brick walls, not unlike the veterans who sometimes found refuge in their shadows. Ghost had chosen this particular doorway carefully. It offered clear sightlines in 3 directions, multiple escape routes, and most importantly, it was within view of several security cameras mounted on nearby businesses. Earlier that day, he'd helped Sarah, the owner of the corner coffee shop, carry in her morning deliveries. She'd rewarded him with a hot coffee and a bag of day-old pastries, which he'd shared with 2 other homeless veterans who frequented the area. They looked out for each other, these forgotten warriors, forming an invisible support network that most people never noticed. Some, like Tommy Doc Williams, had been medics in Afghanistan. Others, like Marcus Preacher Johnson, had driven supply convoys through insurgent territory in Iraq. Ghost's thoughts drifted to his own past as he waited to see what the bikers would do next. He remembered the classified operation in Syria that had changed everything, the mission that had gone sideways when they discovered the children. His team had been forced to make impossible choices that night, choices that still haunted his dreams. The official report had praised their actions, but Ghost couldn't reconcile the metal in his backpack with the weight on his conscience. The old Merchant's Cafe building creaked slightly in the evening breeze, its worn bricks holding a century and a half of Seattle's history. Ghost had researched its past during long hours at the public library, learning how it had survived fires, earthquakes, and countless attempts at modernization. He appreciated its resilience, its ability to remain standing despite everything life had thrown at it. In some ways, he saw himself in those weathered walls. Regular passersby had grown used to his presence. The morning commuters who hurried past with their paper coffee cups often nodded in greeting. Some, like Bill the security guard from the art gallery across the street, would stop for brief conversations. Bill was a Gulf War veteran himself, and though he'd never asked about Ghost's past, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The street lamps were just beginning to flicker on, casting pools of yellow light that pushed back against the growing dusk. The square had begun its nightly transformation, shifting from tourist attraction to a more complex urban landscape. Restaurant workers in clean aprons hurried to their evening shifts, while the first wave of nightlife seekers began to appear, their laughter echoing off the old buildings. Ghost's tactical awareness never wavered, even as he appeared to be lost in thought. He noted the young couple who had quickly crossed the street upon seeing the bikers, the street photographer who had lowered his camera but hadn't left, and the homeless woman who had quietly gathered her belongings and moved away from the potential conflict zone. These were the subtle dynamics of street life that most people never noticed, but which could mean the difference between safety and danger for those who lived there. His military backpack contained everything he owned: a change of clothes, basic hygiene items, a first aid kit, and a few treasured possessions he couldn't bring himself to leave behind. Among them was the bronze star he'd earned on his second tour in Afghanistan, and a worn photograph of his unit from before the Syria mission. The faces in that photo smiled back from a time when he'd still believed in happy endings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evening air carried the mixed scents of the city. Coffee from the cafe, salt air from the bay, and the rich aroma of garlic from the Italian restaurant down the block. These familiar smells had become part of his daily life, anchoring him to the present when memories of the past threatened to pull him under. Even now, with 3 hostile bikers looming over him, these sensory details helped him maintain his calm center. He could feel the tension building in the square like the pressure drop before a storm. The leader of the bikers shifted his weight, a subtle tell that Ghost's combat-trained mind immediately registered. The shortest one had moved slightly to the left, attempting to flank him, while the third hung back unconsciously favoring his injured leg. Their positioning was amateurish, betraying their lack of real combat experience. A metro bus rumbled past, its brakes squealing slightly as it stopped at the corner. A few passengers looked out the windows at the scene unfolding in the doorway, but none made any move to intervene. Ghost didn't blame them. In their shoes, he probably wouldn't have gotten involved either. The world had grown too complicated for simple acts of heroism, or at least that's what most people believed. The modern urban rhythm of Seattle flowed around them, smartphones chiming with messages, car horns honking in the distance, fragments of conversation drifting on the evening air. Yet in Ghost's doorway, time seemed to slow down, compressed into that eternal moment before action becomes inevitable. His breathing remained steady, his muscles relaxed but ready as he waited to see what choice these three men would make. "Get up, old-timer," the leader commanded, his voice carrying the artificial gruffness of someone trying too hard to sound tough. His leather vest, adorned with patches declaring him Blade, creaked as he crossed his arms. Behind him, his two companions spread out in what they probably thought was an intimidating formation. The shorter one, whose vest identified him as Rat, fingered the brass knuckles in his pocket, while the third man, Snake, shifted uncomfortably on his injured leg. The Steel Knights MC wasn't even a real motorcycle club. Ghost had heard about them from other street dwellers. They were weekend warriors who had bought their way into wearing those vests. Wannabe tough guys who spent more time posing at bars than actually riding. Their chapter had a reputation for harassing homeless people in the area, particularly veterans who they saw as easy targets. "This is prime real estate," Blade continued, gesturing at the recessed doorway. "And we've decided it needs some cleaning up." His dyed black beard couldn't hide the softness of his jaw, suggesting more time spent in an office chair than doing actual physical labor. The tattoo on his throat, meant to look tribal and threatening, was still too bright and clean to be more than a few months old. Ghost remained silent, his stillness born from years of combat experience rather than fear. He noticed how Rat kept looking around nervously, trying to spot potential witnesses. Snake, meanwhile, was clearly favoring his right leg. Ghost's trained eye recognized the stance of someone with a recent knee injury, probably from trying to show off on his overpriced Harley. "Hey!" Blade's voice rose, irritation creeping in at being ignored. "I'm talking to you, trash." He kicked at Ghost's blanket, sending a corner of it flapping against the brick wall. The action was meant to provoke a response, to give them an excuse for what they planned to do next. It was the kind of amateur psychology that Ghost had seen countless times, both in combat zones and on the streets. Other homeless people in the vicinity had already moved away, recognizing the signs of imminent violence. A young woman at the bus stop across the street had her phone out, likely recording. People always seem to record everything these days. The street photographer from earlier had also raised his camera again, though he tried to be subtle about it. "Look at this guy," Rat sneered, his voice high and nasal. "Probably another fake vet, using that surplus gear to scam people." He moved closer, emboldened by Ghost's continued silence. "Bet he's never even served. Just another worthless bum pretending to be a hero." The brass knuckles had made their way from his pocket to his hand, glinting dully in the fading light. Snake limped forward, trying to hide his injury. "Maybe we should help him find new accommodation," he suggested, attempting to sound menacing despite the pain evident in his voice. "I heard the waterfront's nice this time of year." The threat was clear. They weren't just planning to make Ghost move, they wanted to hurt him. Ghost could smell alcohol on their breath. Not enough to make them drunk, but just enough to make them dangerous. That sweet spot where liquid courage overshadowed good judgment. Their body language broadcast their intentions like a billboard. The slight forward lean, the clenching and unclenching of fists, the way they kept looking around to check for witnesses while trying to appear casual. A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance, drawn by that morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. Some had their phones out, recording what they probably thought would be just another sad story of homeless harassment. None of them moved to help. Bystander syndrome at its finest. "Last chance, old man," Blade growled, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Either you get up and walk away or we help you leave. And trust me, you don't want our help." He cracked his knuckles for emphasis, a gesture so cliché it would have been amusing under different circumstances. The evening had grown darker, the streetlights casting harsh shadows that made everyone look slightly sinister. A police siren wailed in the distance, but experience had taught Ghost it wouldn't be coming this way. Response times to this part of town were notoriously slow, especially for incidents involving the homeless. Through it all, Ghost remained still, his breathing steady and controlled. His eyes, sharp despite years of hard living, tracked every movement of the three men. He noted how Blade's weight was shifted too far forward, how Rat's grip on his brass knuckles betrayed his nervousness, how Snake's injury made him a liability in any real confrontation. The tension in the air had become almost palpable, drawing more onlookers. Among them, Ghost spotted Bill the security guard speaking urgently into his radio, and Sarah from the coffee shop had stepped outside her door, phone in hand. The street photographer had moved to a better angle, his camera clicking quietly but steadily. "All right, boys," Blade announced, rolling his shoulders like a cartoon character preparing for a fight. "Looks like we're going to have to do this the hard way. Let's show this fake vet what real tough guys can do." He reached down, intending to grab Ghost's collar, not realizing he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Time seemed to slow down as Blade's hand reached toward Ghost's collar. The evening air grew thick with anticipation, and the small crowd of onlookers held their collective breath. Ghost hadn't moved yet, but something had changed in his demeanor, a subtle shift that only someone with combat experience would notice. His eyes, previously downcast, now held a focused intensity that would have given a wiser man pause. Around Pioneer Square, people had stopped their evening routines to watch the scene unfold. Outside the Italian restaurant, servers paused while setting up outdoor tables. Tourists who had been photographing the totem pole now turned their cameras toward the doorway. Even the barista at the corner coffee shop stood in the doorway, her hand hovering near her phone ready to call 911. Bill, the security guard from the art gallery, had moved closer while maintaining a professional distance. His hand rested on his radio as he assessed the situation with the experienced eye of a Gulf War veteran. He'd always sensed there was more to Ghost than met the eye, and now he was about to find out just how right he'd been. The three bikers had unknowingly positioned themselves exactly where Ghost would have placed them if he'd been choreographing this confrontation. Blade stood directly in front, his weight committed forward in a way that would make it difficult to react quickly. Rat had moved to the left, his brass knuckles now fully visible, while Snake's injured leg had him positioned slightly behind the others, creating a triangle formation that would work against them in any real fight. Sarah, the coffee shop owner, had begun recording on her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she documented what was happening. She'd known Ghost for 3 years, had seen his quiet dignity, the way he helped others despite having so little himself. The morning deliveries he'd helped her with were just one example of the small kindnesses he regularly performed, asking nothing in return. More people had gathered across the street, their faces illuminated by the glow of phone screens as they recorded the scene. Among them was Marcus Preacher Johnson, another homeless veteran who frequently shared Ghost's doorway. His military training told him something was about to happen, something these bikers weren't prepared for. The street photographer had positioned himself perfectly, his professional eye recognizing that he was about to capture something significant. His camera clicked rapidly, documenting every moment as the tension built. Later, these photos would tell a story that would resonate across the country, but for now, they simply recorded the calm before the storm. "What's wrong with you, old man?" Rat taunted, his voice betraying a nervousness that didn't match his tough guy act. Too scared to even look up, he flexed his fingers around the brass knuckles, the metal catching the streetlight's glow. His bravado was forced, a thin veneer covering his uncertainty about what they were doing. Snake shifted his weight again, grimacing slightly at the pain in his knee. "Maybe he's just stupid," he suggested, trying to hide his discomfort. "Too many years on the street probably fried his brain." The comment drew a harsh laugh from Blade, But there was an edge to it, a growing frustration at Ghost's continued non-response. The evening traffic had slowed as drivers rubbernecked to see what was happening. A metro bus had stopped at the corner, its passengers pressing against the windows for a better view. The driver, a Vietnam veteran himself, reached for his radio, preparing to report the incident. Ghost's breathing remained steady and controlled, his muscles relaxed but ready. His mind, still sharp after all these years, calculated angles and distances, noting potential weapons and obstacles in his immediate vicinity. The worn military backpack beside him contained his most precious possessions, but it could also serve as a defensive tool if needed. A police siren wailed in the distance, but it was moving away from them, heading toward some other crisis in the city. The sound seemed to embolden Blade, who probably figured they had time to do whatever they planned before any authorities arrived. It was the kind of miscalculation that experience had taught Ghost to expect from amateur bullies. "All right, guys," Blade announced, cracking his knuckles again. "Let's show this fake vet what happens when you disrespect the Steel Knights." He moved his hand closer to Ghost's collar, not realizing he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by that universal human instinct that makes us unable to look away from impending conflict. They couldn't know they were about to witness something that would challenge their preconceptions about homeless veterans and go viral across social media platforms worldwide. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension as Blade's fingers brushed against Ghost's worn jacket. In that crucial moment, time compressed into a singular point of decision, a familiar sensation to Ghost from his years in combat. His muscles coiled imperceptibly, ready to unleash years of training and experience. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on social media, analyzed by martial arts experts, and used in training videos for law enforcement across the country. The moment Blade's fingers made contact with Ghost's collar, 15 years of force recon training crystallized into pure, fluid motion. Before anyone could register what was happening, Ghost's hand had already locked around Blade's wrist in a grip that felt like steel cables. The biker's eyes widened in shock as he suddenly found himself off balance, his arm trapped in a hold he didn't even understand. It was the kind of technique that couldn't be learned in weekend self-defense classes or by watching UFC fights. This was the result of years of specialized military training. Ghost rose from his seated position with a smoothness that belied his apparent age and condition. His movements had the economy of motion that only comes from countless hours of practical combat experience. The hood of his worn jacket fell back, revealing eyes that were no longer those of a defeated homeless man, but rather showed the focused intensity of a skilled operator. "I wouldn't," Ghost said quietly to Rat, who had started to raise his brass-knuckled fist. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had commanded men in combat situations. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound seemed to freeze everyone in place. Even the crowd across the street had fallen silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Blade found himself held in a position that negated all his supposed strength, his arm locked in a way that sent sharp warnings of pain shooting through his shoulder. Despite his size advantage, he suddenly felt very small and very amateur. The techniques he'd learned in bar fights and motorcycle club scuffles meant nothing against this level of expertise. Snake, attempting to help despite his injured knee, moved forward, only to find himself backing away again, as Ghost's free hand made a subtle gesture that promised consequences. Years of close-quarters combat training had taught Ghost how to control multiple opponents through positioning and psychology. He had automatically moved to a spot that forced the three bikers to cluster awkwardly, their own bodies now obstacles to each other. Bill, the security guard, recognized the techniques from his military days. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered into his radio. "This guy's force recon." He had seen this level of skill before, during joint training exercises, and he knew these bikers had just picked a fight with the wrong person entirely. The street photographer's camera clicked rapidly, capturing the moment Ghost's true nature revealed itself. The transformation was striking. His posture had shifted from seemingly defeated to absolutely commanding. Despite his worn clothes and unkempt appearance, he suddenly projected an aura of absolute control that made everyone present realize they had badly misjudged the situation. "Force recon?" Preacher whispered from his position across the street, recognition dawning in his eyes. Like many veterans, he knew what that meant. The Force reconnaissance companies were among the Marine Corps' most elite special operations units, tasked with some of the most dangerous missions in modern warfare. Ghost's combat-trained mind had already assessed and dismissed multiple ways to end this confrontation violently. He could have broken Blade's arm in at least 3 places from this position. He could have used the biker's own momentum to slam him face first into the brick wall. He could have transitioned into any number of takedowns that would have left all 3 attackers unconscious on the sidewalk. Instead, he maintained the controlling hold with precisely calibrated pressure, enough to demonstrate his absolute control of the situation, but not enough to cause actual damage. This was another aspect of his training, the ability to use minimum force to achieve maximum effect. "The brass knuckles," Ghost said calmly, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent square. "Drop them." It wasn't a request, and Rat's fingers opened almost involuntarily, the metal weapon clattering to the concrete. The sound seemed unusually loud in the tension-filled air. Sarah, still recording on her phone, noticed something remarkable. Despite the situation, Ghost's breathing remained calm and measured. There was no sign of exertion, no indication of stress or anger. This wasn't an emotional response to a threat. This was a professional handling a situation he had been trained to control. The crowd had grown larger, but now they stood in respectful silence, witnessing something that defied their expectations. This wasn't the usual sad spectacle of homeless harassment. They were watching years of elite military training and combat experience in action, deployed with a precision and control that few civilians ever get to witness. In that moment, as Blade's face reddened with a combination of pain and embarrassment, as Rat stood frozen with his empty hand still raised, as Snake shifted uncertainly on his injured leg, everyone present began to understand just how badly they had underestimated the man they dismissed as just another homeless veteran. "Listen carefully," Ghost said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention in combat zones. "I'm going to release you, and you're going to make a choice." He maintained the controlling hold on Blade's wrist, applying just enough pressure to keep the biker's attention focused. "That choice will determine how this ends." The growing crowd watched in absolute silence as the scene unfolded. The street photographer's camera continued its steady documentation, capturing the stark contrast between Ghost's calm control and the biker's increasing realization of their mistake. The evening air felt charged with potential energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "You don't know who you're messing with," Blade attempted to growl, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying his uncertainty. The bravado that had seemed so convincing earlier now sounded hollow, like a child trying to sound tough on a playground. His free hand opened and closed nervously, unsure whether to attempt resistance. Ghost allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Actually," he said, his voice remaining measured and professional, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. 3 members of an unofficial motorcycle club trying to prove something to themselves by harassing someone they thought couldn't fight back." His eyes shifted momentarily to Snake's injured knee. "You hurt yourself 2 weeks ago showing off in the parking lot of Murphy's bar. Tried to drag race, didn't you?" Snake's face registered shock. The incident hadn't been reported anywhere. It was just bar gossip. But Ghost had heard it from the network of homeless veterans who shared information about potential threats. His awareness of this detail seemed to unsettle the bikers even more than his physical control of their leader. "Your vest patches are new," Ghost continued, addressing Rat, who still stood frozen in place. "The stitching hasn't even had time to weather. You bought your way into wearing those colors, but you haven't earned them." Each word struck with the precision of a surgical strike, dismantling their carefully constructed tough guy image. Bill, the security guard, had moved closer, his military training allowing him to recognize the level of skill Ghost was displaying. This wasn't just about physical control. This was psychological dominance, the kind taught to elite units for handling multiple adversaries without resorting to lethal force. "Here's what's going to happen," Ghost said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "I'm going to release you. You're going to pick up your friend's brass knuckles, and you're going to leave. You're going to spend some time thinking about why you feel the need to harass homeless veterans to feel tough." The crowd had grown larger, with people instinctively forming a loose circle around the scene. Phones recorded from every angle, capturing what was quickly becoming a moment that would challenge assumptions about homeless veterans across social media platforms. "And if we don't?" Blade managed to ask, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. Ghost's grip shifted slightly, sending a fresh wave of warning pain through the biker's arm, demonstrating just how much control he actually had over the situation. "Then I stop being nice," Ghost replied simply. The words carried no hint of threat or bravado, just the calm statement of fact from someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. "And I start using the skills that kept me alive through 3 tours with Force Recon and 5 years of special operations." The revelation sent a ripple through the watching crowd. Force Recon was legendary even among civilians, and the implications of Ghost's statement hung heavy in the air. Several veterans in the crowd straightened instinctively, recognition and respect evident in their postures. "The choice is yours," Ghost continued, his voice still professionally neutral. "But consider this. Right now, dozens of people are recording this. Your reputations are already damaged. The only question is whether you leave here with your dignity relatively intact, or whether this becomes an even more embarrassing viral video." Sarah's hands had steadied as she continued recording, her phone capturing every word. She had always sensed there was more to Ghost than his humble appearance suggested, but this level of professional skill and control exceeded anything she had imagined. Around them, Pioneer Square had fallen into an almost reverent silence. Even the usual city sounds seemed muted, as if Seattle itself was holding its breath to see how this would play out. The streetlights cast dramatic shadows across the scene, highlighting the tableau of the controlled professional and the deflated would-be tough guys. With the same fluid motion that had started this confrontation, Ghost released his hold on Blade's wrist. The biker stumbled back slightly, rubbing his arm where the controlling hold had been applied. The loss of face was evident in his reddening features, visible even under the harsh street lighting of Pioneer Square. "Your move," Ghost said quietly, his stance relaxed but ready. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared vulnerable, standing alone against 3 larger men. But veterans in the crowd, particularly Bill and Preacher, recognized the perfectly balanced posture of someone who could explode into devastating action at any moment. Blade looked at his companions, seeking support, but found none. Rat couldn't meet his eyes, still processing how quickly their attempt at intimidation had been turned against them. Snake had backed up another step, his injured knee making him even more hesitant now that he understood who they were dealing with. The crowd watched in tense silence as Blade's internal struggle played across his face. His reputation was already in tatters. The videos being recorded would see to that. The only question was whether his ego would drive him to make an even bigger mistake. Ghost waited patiently, his breathing steady, his eyes tracking every subtle movement of the 3 men. "Last chance," Ghost added, his voice carrying that particular tone of command that only comes from years of leading men in combat situations. "Make the smart choice." His hands remained loose at his sides, but anyone with combat experience could see he was ready to respond to any aggressive move with overwhelming force. Sarah's phone captured the moment Blade's resistance crumbled. His shoulders sagged slightly, the artificial toughness draining from his posture. "Come on," he muttered to his companions, trying to salvage some semblance of dignity. "This ain't worth it." He bent down slowly, carefully, to pick up the dropped brass knuckles. Ghost's eyes never left them as they backed away, his tactical awareness tracking their movements until they reached their motorcycles. The crowd parted silently to let them pass, phones still recording their departure. The sound of their motorcycle engines starting up seemed unusually loud in the tension-filled air. As the bikers rode away, their taillights disappearing into the Seattle evening, Ghost's posture relaxed slightly. The watching crowd burst into spontaneous applause, but he paid it no attention. Instead, he calmly bent down to straighten his blanket and rearrange his few possessions. that had been disturbed during the confrontation. Bill approached first, his security guard uniform neat and pressed, offering a crisp salute. "Force Recon, sir?" he asked, respect evident in his voice. Gulf War veteran myself, but I've never seen anything like that outside of special operations training videos. Ghost returned the salute out of professional courtesy, his movements precise despite years of hard living. "We all serve in our own ways," he replied quietly, neither confirming nor denying his specific background. The humility in his response spoke volumes to those who understood military service. The street photographer approached next, his camera still in hand. "Sir," he said, "I'm from the Seattle Times. What you just did, people need to see this. Not just the physical control, but the restraint, the professionalism. Would you be willing to tell your story?" Before Ghost could respond, Sarah stepped forward protectively. "He's not a circus act," she said firmly, though her phone was still recording. "He's a man who just defended himself with more dignity than those attackers deserved." Her defense of Ghost seemed to resonate with the crowd, many of whom nodded in agreement. Through it all, Ghost maintained the same calm demeanor that had served him through countless combat situations. His eyes continued to scan the surroundings, a habit ingrained by years of operational experience. He noted how the crowd's perception of him had shifted, how they no longer saw a homeless man, but instead recognized a warrior who had chosen to live on society's margins. Preacher made his way through the crowd, carrying himself with the dignity of someone who recognized a superior operator. "Master Sergeant," he said quietly, using the rank with certainty, though Ghost had never mentioned it. That was textbook. They'll be studying this video at the basic school next week. The evening had grown darker, but phones continued to record as Ghost carefully repacked his military backpack. His movements were precise and economical, reflecting years of training that had become second nature. The crowd watched in respectful silence, their previous assumptions about homeless veterans thoroughly shattered. The sound of approaching sirens finally broke through the evening air as two Seattle Police Department cruisers pulled up to Pioneer Square. Officer Rachel Martinez, a former Army MP, stepped out first, immediately assessing the situation with practiced eyes. Her partner, Officer Tom Davidson, followed close behind, noting the unusually respectful demeanor of the gathered crowd. "We received multiple calls," Officer Martinez said, approaching the scene professionally. "Something about bikers harassing a homeless man?" She looked around, clearly expecting to find a victim in need of medical attention. Instead, she found an orderly crowd, many still recording with their phones, and Ghost calmly sitting in his doorway as if nothing unusual had happened. Bill stepped forward, his security guard credentials visible. "Officers, you'll want to see this," he said, holding up his phone. "I've got the whole thing recorded, from start to finish, and you're not going to believe what you're seeing." He glanced at Ghost with newfound respect. This gentleman just gave a master class in professional restraint and combat control. Officer Martinez watched the video, her military training allowing her to recognize the high-level techniques being employed. Her eyes widened slightly as she observed Ghost's perfect execution of the control holds. "Sir," she addressed Ghost directly, "I'm going to need to take a statement, but first, that was Force Recon level work." "Just a citizen defending himself, officer," Ghost replied quietly, his humility evident. "Those young men made some poor choices, but no one was seriously hurt." His calm demeanor and professional response made several nearby veterans stand a little straighter, recognizing the bearing of a senior NCO. Sarah from the coffee shop had already started organizing the various videos from witnesses, creating a digital record of the incident. "I've got clear footage of them initiating the confrontation," she told the officers, including their threats and the brass knuckles they were carrying. The crowd had begun to thin, but those who remained were no longer the usual mixture of curious onlookers and passive bystanders. Most were veterans or service members who had recognized the level of skill they'd witnessed. They formed a loose, protective circle around Ghost's position, their respect evident in their bearing. "We'll need to put out a BOLO for those three," Officer Davidson said, taking notes. "Assault, attempted battery, carrying illegal weapons." He looked up at Ghost. "Would you be willing to press charges, sir?" The Zir came automatically, his instincts recognizing authority despite Ghost's homeless status. Ghost considered the question carefully. The same thoughtful analysis he'd once applied to mission parameters now focused on this situation. "No," he finally said. "I think they learned their lesson. Sometimes the best teaching tool is surviving your own mistake." A young paramedic who had arrived with the police stood nearby, clearly uncertain whether his services were needed. Ghost's perfect control of the situation had ensured that no one, not even the aggressors, required medical attention, a testament to his exceptional training and restraint. "At least let us take a full statement," Officer Martinez insisted, her notepad ready. "These individuals might try this with someone else, someone without your particular set of skills." She chose her words carefully, recognizing that Ghost might not want his full background revealed. As Ghost provided his statement, more details of his expertise became apparent through his precise, professional description of events. He broke down the incident with military efficiency, describing angles, positions, and force applications in a way that only someone with extensive combat training could manage. The street photographer, who had introduced himself as Mike Chen from the Seattle Times, stood respectfully to the side, his camera capturing the aftermath. "This is going to change the conversation about homeless veterans," he said quietly to Sarah. "People need to understand that the man they pass by on the street might be a highly trained warrior who's just fallen on hard times." A detective's car pulled up, its lights off, but antenna array marking it as an unmarked police vehicle. Detective Sarah Williams stepped out, already looking at video footage on her phone. "This is going viral," she announced, approaching the group. "We've got 3 different angles trending on social media already." The detective's arrival marked a shift in the official response. What had started as a routine harassment call had evolved into something that would have lasting implications for how society viewed its homeless veterans. Ghost's demonstration of professional skill and restraint was already challenging preconceptions across social media platforms. "Sir," Detective Williams addressed Ghost directly, "I know you don't want to press charges, but would you consider talking to our training division? What you demonstrated here, that level of control and restraint, it's exactly what we try to teach our officers." Ghost looked up at the detective, his eyes showing a depth of experience that made her instinctively stand straighter. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the best victory is the one where everyone walks away having learned something." His words carried the weight of countless combat experiences, distilled into a simple but profound truth. By midnight, the video of Ghost's encounter with the bikers had exploded across social media platforms. The Seattle Times had published a preliminary article online, featuring Mike Chen's photographs that captured the precise moment when Ghost had transformed from seemingly vulnerable homeless man to clearly evident professional operator. The images were striking, showing controlled expertise rather than aggressive violence. Major Thomas Reynolds, commanding officer of the local Marine Corps recruiting station, arrived at Pioneer Square just before dawn. He found Ghost in his usual spot, the veteran's bearing still impeccable despite his circumstances. "Master Sergeant Harrison," the major said quietly, using Ghost's real name for the first time in years. "We've been looking for you." Ghost looked up, his eyes showing recognition of the protocol but no surprise at being identified. The videos had made identification inevitable. His technique was too distinctive, his training too specific to remain anonymous. "Major," he acknowledged simply, neither accepting nor rejecting the implicit offer in the officer's presence. "Your handling of last night's situation has gone well beyond viral," the major continued, standing at parade rest. "The commandant himself viewed the footage this morning. Your demonstration of core values, discipline, restraint, professionalism, it's exactly what we need right now." Sarah arrived with fresh coffee for Ghost, eyeing the major cautiously. She had become protective of the veteran who had helped her with deliveries for years, never hinting at his extensive military background. "He's not a recruitment poster," she said firmly, handing Ghost the steaming cup. The major smiled diplomatically. "No, ma'am. He's something far more valuable. He's a living example of what proper training and professional restraint look like. The Corps isn't interested in exploiting him. We want to offer him a chance to teach others what he demonstrated last night. Throughout the square, the morning routine had begun, but there was a different energy today. People who had previously hurried past now slowed down, some offering respectful nods to Ghost. A group of young Marines from the local reserve unit stood at a respectful distance, clearly hoping to speak with him. The video's been shared by every major military training facility, the major continued. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit wants to study your de-escalation technique. Police academies across the country are requesting copies for their training programs. You showed them something they rarely see: perfect control without excessive force. Ghost sipped his coffee thoughtfully, his movement still carrying that economy of motion that marked him as special operations. Those young men, he said finally, they needed a lesson, not a beating. Sometimes the hardest thing is choosing not to use the full measure of force available to you. A sleek government car pulled up to the curb, and a woman in a crisp business suit stepped out. "Master Sergeant Harrison," she said, approaching with a formal manner. "I'm Amanda Chen, Director of Veteran Affairs for the Pacific Northwest region. What you did last night has opened up a conversation we've needed to have for a long time." The morning sun had begun to paint Pioneer Square in warm colors, highlighting the contrast between Ghost's humble surroundings and the growing group of officials gathering around him. Bill, arriving for his morning security shift, watched with interest as more vehicles arrived carrying various military and government representatives. "We're not just here about last night," Director Chen continued. "Your record: 3 tours with Force Recon, 5 years training special operations, multiple commendations. Combined with what you demonstrated in that video, it's exactly what our veteran outreach program needs." The young Marines from the reserve unit had edged closer, drawn by the obvious importance of the gathering. One of them, a fresh-faced lance corporal, finally worked up the courage to speak. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the eagerness of youth, "that technique you used, could you teach us?" Ghost looked at the young Marine, seeing in him the same dedication he had once possessed. The major noticed the look and pressed his advantage gently. "That's what we're offering, Master Sergeant. A chance to take your experience, your control, your professionalism, and pass it on to the next generation." Sarah returned with more coffee for the growing group, her protective instincts still evident. "Whatever you decide," she said to Ghost, "your spot here is always secure. Some of us haven't forgotten who helped us all these years, even before we knew who you really were." Director Chen pulled out a folder, handling it with obvious respect. "We have opportunities available immediately. Training positions, speaking engagements, veteran outreach coordination. Your choice, your terms, Master Sergeant. What you showed us last night needs to be shared." The morning crowd had begun to gather, many filming with their phones, creating second-wave social media content as they recognized the man from last night's viral video. Ghost remained calm at the center of the growing attention, his bearing still reflecting years of professional service despite his current circumstances. By noon, the video of Ghost's encounter had reached over 10 million views across various platforms. Social media experts were calling it a watershed moment in how society viewed homeless veterans. The hashtag number #NotJustHomeless was trending nationwide, with veterans sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. CNN had set up a remote broadcast location near Pioneer Square, their reporter standing in front of Ghost's now famous doorway. "Behind me is where last night's viral incident took place," she reported, "where a homeless Marine Corps veteran demonstrated that appearances can be deeply deceiving. His display of professional restraint has sparked a national conversation about how we treat our veterans." Mike Chen's photographs had been picked up by major news outlets worldwide. His series of images captured the transformation perfectly: the initial confrontation, Ghost's controlled response, and the moment the bikers realized their mistake. The New York Times had placed one of his shots on their digital front page with the headline, "The Warrior in the Doorway, a lesson in judgment and restraint." Inside Sarah's coffee shop, now serving as an impromptu media center, a group of veteran advocates gathered to discuss the implications of what had happened. "This isn't just about one incident," said Dr. James Wilson, a specialist in veteran affairs. This forces us to confront our assumptions about homeless veterans. How many other highly trained professionals are we walking past every day? The three bikers had released a public statement through their lawyer, expressing deep remorse for their actions. "We made assumptions based on appearances," their statement read, "and in doing so, we not only embarrassed ourselves but disrespected a decorated Marine Corps veteran. Our actions do not reflect the values of the riding community." Social media continued to explode with new angles of the incident. Each video showed something different: Ghost's perfect form, his calm demeanor, the controlled application of force. Martial arts instructors were posting analysis videos, breaking down his technique. "This is textbook close-quarters combat," one expert explained. "But what's most impressive is the restraint shown." The local veterans community had mobilized in force. Dozens of former service members now stood guard around Pioneer Square, ensuring no media outlets harassed Ghost while he considered his options. Among them was Tommy "Doc" Williams, the former combat medic who had known Ghost for years without knowing his background. "Man, I should have seen it," Doc said to a group of gathered veterans. "The way he moved, how he always seemed to know what was happening around him. Classic force recon situational awareness. We just never looked past the surface." Outside the square, a group of motorcycle clubs, real ones, not wannabes like the three who had caused the incident, had organized a ride of respect. Hundreds of bikes lined the surrounding streets, many riders wearing veteran patches. Their presence sent a clear message: the homeless veteran community had powerful allies. The incident had triggered responses from unexpected quarters. Silicon Valley tech companies were announcing initiatives to hire homeless veterans. Police departments across the country were requesting training programs based on Ghost's demonstration of controlled response. Military recruitment offices reported increased interest, particularly in special operations programs. "What we witnessed," commented retired General Michael Hayes on a national news broadcast, "was the perfect execution of military training and values. This veteran, despite his circumstances, maintained his professionalism and used minimum force to control a potentially dangerous situation. That's the kind of judgment we strive to instill in our forces." Local businesses around Pioneer Square had begun putting up signs: "Veterans welcome here," and "Respect our heroes," all of them. Sarah's coffee shop had a line around the block, people hoping to catch a glimpse of Ghost or simply show their support by buying coffee where he was known. The viral spread had reached international levels. British, German, and Japanese media outlets were running stories about the incident, using it to discuss their own treatment of veterans. Military training facilities worldwide were requesting copies of the video for their instruction programs. A group of local children had set up a small table near Ghost's doorway, selling lemonade to raise money for homeless veterans. Their hand-drawn sign read, "Heroes don't always wear uniforms." Their parents stood nearby, using the moment to teach important lessons about judgment and respect. Reddit threads analyzing the incident had garnered hundreds of thousands of comments. Veterans were sharing their own stories, creating a powerful narrative about the hidden strengths within the homeless veteran community. The conversation had shifted from shock at Ghost's skills to serious discussions about veteran support and rehabilitation. The Steel Knights MC, the motorcycle club the three aggressors had claimed to represent, had publicly expelled them and donated $50,000 to veteran housing initiatives. These men dishonored themselves, our club, and most importantly, they dishonored a veteran, their president announced. "We're taking steps to ensure this never happens again." 1 week after the incident, Ghost stood before a packed auditorium at the Seattle Police Academy. His appearance had transformed, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing pressed tactical training gear provided by the Marines. Yet he maintained the same calm, controlled presence that had made the viral video so compelling. "Combat effectiveness isn't about aggression," he explained to the assembled officers and cadets. "It's about control of yourself, your emotions, and the situation." He demonstrated the same hold he had used on Blade, now with a willing volunteer from the Academy staff. "Notice the pressure points. You're not trying to hurt them, you're trying to control them." The audience watched intently as Ghost broke down each movement, explaining the psychology behind his approach. In the front row, Officer Martinez nodded appreciatively, taking detailed notes. Behind her, several veteran officers who had initially been skeptical of learning from a formerly homeless vet were now leaning forward, completely engaged. "Your greatest weapon," Ghost continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "isn't your firearm, your baton, or your training. It's your ability to stay calm under pressure. When you remain professional, you control the narrative." He released his volunteer, who rubbed his wrist with newfound respect. Director Chen stood at the back of the auditorium, watching with satisfaction. The VA's decision to appoint Ghost as a special instructor had already proven valuable. His combination of elite military training and street-level experience offered perspectives that no traditional instructor could match. "In the doorway that night," Ghost explained, "I had multiple options for dealing with those 3 men. Most of them would have ended with serious injuries." He paused, letting that sink in. But causing harm wasn't the objective. The objective was to control the situation while minimizing damage. To them, to myself, and to the community's trust. The training session had drawn observers from various agencies. FBI instructors sat alongside Marine Corps combat trainers, all taking notes on Ghost's methodology. His approach to de-escalation was proving revolutionary, combining military precision with street-smart psychology. "Watch this again," Ghost said, replaying the viral video on the auditorium's screen. "Notice how I never met aggression with aggression. That's crucial. The moment you match their emotional state, you've lost control of the situation." He pointed out subtle details that most viewers had missed. His breathing patterns, his economy of movement, his strategic positioning. In the afternoon, Ghost worked with smaller groups, providing hands-on instruction. His teaching style was methodical yet accessible, breaking down complex combat techniques into learnable components. "These skills," he explained to a group of rookie officers, "work whether you're in tactical gear or sleeping rough. The principles don't change." Sarah had come to watch, bringing coffee for everyone as usual. She marveled at how Ghost maintained his humility despite his new position. Between sessions, he still spoke with homeless veterans who came to see him, offering guidance and support with the same quiet dignity he'd shown on the streets. "The streets teach you something that no training facility can," Ghost told his students. "They teach you that every person, no matter their current situation, deserves to be treated with respect. That lesson saves lives." He demonstrated another control technique, this time showing how to subdue someone without causing harm or humiliation. Local news crews filmed portions of the training for their evening broadcasts. The story had evolved from the initial viral sensation to something more substantial, a conversation about police training, veteran rehabilitation, and community relations. Ghost's example was challenging long-held assumptions about use of force and professional restraint. "What we're learning here," commented Police Chief Roberts to assembled reporters, "goes beyond tactical training. Master Sergeant Harrison is teaching us about dignity, both maintaining our own and respecting others. That's invaluable for modern law enforcement." During breaks, Ghost spoke with veteran officers, sharing experiences and insights. His time on the streets had given him a unique perspective on law enforcement challenges. "Sometimes," he explained, "the person you're confronting isn't a bad person. They're just someone having their worst day. Your job is to make sure it doesn't become their last day." The training session concluded with a practical demonstration. Ghost worked with a group of officers, showing them how to handle multiple aggressive subjects without resorting to excessive force. His techniques emphasized control over confrontation, protection over punishment. "Remember," he said in closing, "every encounter is a chance to make a positive difference. The way you handle yourself in those crucial moments doesn't just affect you. It affects your department, your community, and the entire profession." His words carried the dual authority of someone who had experienced both sides of law enforcement encounters. 1 month after the incident in Pioneer Square, the ripple effects of Ghost's viral moment continued to transform lives across the country. The Seattle Times published a follow-up story titled, "The Ghost Effect: How one moment changed how we see homeless veterans, detailing the nationwide impact of that evening's events. The three bikers who had initiated the confrontation had undergone a remarkable transformation themselves. Blade, whose real name was Robert Turner, had enrolled in a veteran support program and now volunteered at the local VA hospital. Meeting Ghost, Master Sergeant Harrison, changed everything, he told reporters. He could have destroyed us, physically and legally. Instead, he taught us about real strength. The Steel Knights MC had transformed their club policies, establishing a veteran outreach program and mandatory training for all members on respectful interaction with the homeless community. Their example had inspired other motorcycle clubs across the country to launch similar initiatives. The hashtag #Bikers Support Vets had become a movement of its own. Ghost's doorway in Pioneer Square had become something of a pilgrimage site. A small plaque now marked the spot. On this site, a homeless veteran demonstrated that true strength lies not in the force we use, but in the force we choose not to use. The city had initially planned a larger memorial, but Ghost had insisted on something modest. Sarah's coffee shop had become a hub for veteran support activities. She had hired 3 homeless veterans as staff members, and her example had inspired other local businesses to do the same. Ghost showed us that everyone deserves a second chance, she explained. Sometimes people just need someone to look past the surface. The police academy had completely revised its training protocols based on Ghost's teachings. The Harrison method, as it had come to be known, emphasized de-escalation and controlled response over aggressive intervention. Departments across the country were reporting significant reductions in use of force incidents after implementing his techniques. Major social media platforms had picked up the story's deeper implications. Documentary filmmakers were producing features about hidden veterans in America's homeless population. One viral video series, The Warriors Among Us, highlighted stories of other homeless veterans whose skills and dignity remained intact despite their circumstances. The VA had launched a new identification and outreach program, actively searching for veterans among the homeless population who might possess valuable skills and experience. The Ghost incident showed us that we were overlooking an incredible resource, Director Chen explained. These veterans haven't lost their training or their value to society. Universities had begun studying what they called the Ghost phenomenon, how a single incident of professional restraint had triggered such widespread social change. Sociology departments were conducting research on public perceptions of homeless veterans before and after the viral video. Ghost himself had maintained his humble approach despite his new position and influence. He still spent time in Pioneer Square, now teaching informal classes to homeless veterans on maintaining their dignity and using their military training positively in civilian life. His students included former special operations personnel, combat medics, and intelligence specialists, all of whom had fallen on hard times but retained their core training. The 3 original videos of the incident had been viewed over 50 million times collectively. Police academies, military training facilities, and martial arts dojos around the world used them as teaching tools. But more than the physical techniques, they emphasized Ghost's message about professional restraint and human dignity. Local schools had developed programs around the incident, teaching students about judgment, respect, and the hidden strengths of people they might overlook. The Ghost lesson, as teachers called it, used the viral video to start discussions about homelessness, veterans' issues, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. The incident had sparked a national conversation about veteran homelessness that reached the highest levels of government. New legislation was being proposed, inspired by Ghost's story, to improve veteran support services and create training opportunities for homeless veterans to use their military skills in civilian careers. Private sector companies had taken notice as well. Several security firms had started recruiting programs specifically targeting homeless veterans, recognizing that their military training and experience remained valuable despite their current circumstances. These programs included housing support and transition assistance. The real change, Ghost explained to a journalist doing a 1-month follow-up piece, isn't about me or what happened that night. It's about people realizing that circumstances don't define capability. Every person deserves to be judged by their actions and character, not their situation. 3 months after the incident, Ghost stood at his old doorway in Pioneer Square, now wearing the crisp uniform of a Marine Corps training instructor. The transformation in his appearance was striking, but the calm dignity that had caught the world's attention remained unchanged. He wasn't there to teach or give interviews. He had returned to remember where this chapter of his life had begun. Sarah brought him his usual coffee, just like she had done countless mornings when he was still living on the streets. "The square feels different without you here," she said, standing beside him. "But look at all the good that's come from that night." She gestured toward her coffee shop, where 3 formerly homeless veterans now worked regular shifts, their lives transformed by the opportunities that had sprung from Ghost's viral moment. Across the square, Bill was training a new security guard, another veteran who had been living on the streets until the new outreach programs found him. The Ghost Initiative, as the VA's new identification program had been officially named, had already helped over 500 veterans nationwide transition from homelessness to meaningful employment. "You know what the best part is?" Ghost said, sipping his coffee. "Those 3 bikers. They could have let anger or embarrassment drive them to destructive choices. Instead, they chose to learn and grow." He nodded toward the corner where Blade, Robert Turner, was now leading a weekly support group for veterans struggling with PTSD and homelessness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pioneer Square, much like it had on that fateful evening. But now, instead of tension and prejudice, the square radiated a sense of community and understanding. Veterans who might once have hidden their military background now wore their service with quiet pride, regardless of their current circumstances. Sometimes, Ghost reflected, watching a group of police cadets practicing his de-escalation techniques in the square, the greatest victories aren't won through force, they're won through understanding. The cadets moved with careful precision, focusing on control rather than dominance, just as he had taught them. Mike Chen, the photographer whose images had helped tell the story, arrived with an advance copy of his new book, Hidden Warriors, America's Homeless Veterans. The cover featured his now famous shot of Ghost at the moment of the confrontation, perfectly composed, showing both professional control and human dignity. "Your story changed how people see homeless veterans," Mike said, handing Ghost a copy. "But more importantly, it changed how some veterans see themselves." The book was filled with portraits of homeless veterans across America, each one captured with dignity and respect, their stories told in their own words. Ghost ran his hand over the book's cover, remembering the long journey that had brought him to this moment. "In Force Recon," he said quietly, "we learned that the most powerful weapon isn't our training or our equipment. It's our ability to maintain our humanity in difficult situations." A young Marine lieutenant approached, waiting respectfully until Ghost acknowledged him. "Sir," he said, "your handling of that situation is now part of our core training at Quantico. But it's not just the physical techniques, it's the lesson about carrying ourselves with dignity no matter the circumstances." The square had filled with people as the workday ended, many nodding respectfully as they passed. Some stopped to shake Ghost's hand or thank him for his service, not just his military service, but for showing them a better way to handle conflict and judge others. "The streets taught me something important," Ghost told the lieutenant. "Every person has a story, has value, has dignity. Our job, whether we're Marines, police officers, or just human beings, is to remember that, especially in moments of confrontation." Director Chen arrived with news from Washington. The Ghost Initiative was being expanded nationwide, with increased funding and support. "Your moment here didn't just go viral," she said. "It started a movement. We're finding veterans we never knew were out there, getting them the help and opportunities they deserve." As the sun set over Seattle, Ghost took one last look at his old doorway. The small plaque caught the fading light, its simple message a reminder of how one moment of professional restraint had sparked a national conversation about dignity, judgment, and the warriors who walk among us unrecognized. "The real lesson," Ghost said, preparing to leave the square, "isn't about fighting or control techniques. It's about maintaining our principles even in difficult circumstances. True strength isn't about dominating others. It's about maintaining our own dignity and respecting the dignity of others." The three bikers' motorcycles still sat parked at the corner, but now they carried different riders, veterans helping other veterans, their leather vests bearing new patches that read, "Warriors helping warriors." The transformation from that night's confrontation to today's cooperation stood as a testament to the power of choosing understanding over violence. Every day, Ghost concluded, we have a choice about how we treat others, how we respond to confrontation, how we judge people based on appearances. That night in Pioneer Square, I made my choice. The real victory wasn't in controlling those three men. It was in helping them find a better path. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.